All right, so we're on to our second part of today's review of the Odyssey. Epic terms, Greek terms, stuff like that. So, if you recall, back when we first introduced mythology and the Odyssey, we dealt with oral tradition. These are stories that come from a time before the written word and were passed down through the generations by word of mouth. The Odyssey is one of these stories. It just happened to be the story that people were telling and was very popular when Greece transitioned from a storytelling oral country to a written tradition country. And so it got written down. But it's got a lot of evidence that it was an oral story in repeated passages with the same language, in the reliance on hospitality as if it's being told by a storyteller, in the capturing of the storyteller's voice. There's all those sorts of things. The Odyssey is an example of a heroic epic. It's a long narrative poem. It was actually written in dactylic hexameter. We still get it in sort of poetic form in Fitzgerald's translation, but again, it's a translation from the ancient Greek. That includes an epic hero, we're going to deal with that in a second, and either a battle between good and evil or events of historical importance. So I don't think you can really argue that Odysseus going home is an event of historical importance. If you read the Iliad, which came before, the siege of Troy and the fall of Troy is a historically important and relevant event, but this one, not so much. However, a battle between good and evil, is the Cyclops evil? Yes. Are the suitors evil? Emphatically, yes. So we do have a battle between good and evil that's sort of at the center of the Odyssey, very much a heroic epic. Odysseus, is he an epic hero? An epic hero is a person of high social status. Odysseus is king of Ithaca, so check. Who has superhuman abilities? Well, he's the only one who can string that bow, so clearly he's got some strength. But he's also very intelligent, very able to solve any kind of riddle or puzzle or difficulty that comes to him. And he's great at tricking people. So you could say that he has superhuman abilities. I think yes. I mean, even his ability to, I know it was aided by Athena, but to turn into a beggar and nobody recognizes him, clearly superhuman. His own son doesn't recognize him. Um, and then represents the values of his culture. When you think about hospitality and some of the lessons that the story is trying to teach, Odysseus is obviously somebody who represents the Greek values. So I think you can say, yes, Odysseus is an epic hero. Divine intervention is when the gods or God gets involved to aid a character, usually the protagonist or the antagonist. There's both positive and negative divine intervention. Poseidon is constantly intervening against Odysseus. Athena is constantly intervening for Odysseus. So anytime Athena does something that actively helps Odysseus out, we can call that divine intervention. Anytime that Poseidon is doing something specific that ends up hurting Odysseus, we can call that divine intervention against him. So I think there's plenty of examples of divine intervention. There's also Telemachus who gets divine intervention from Athena. Hermes comes and helps Odysseus defeat Circe. So there's plenty of examples of divine intervention in these stories. You should be able to identify one. A quest is a long, dangerous journey designed to prove something about the hero, and different journeys have different heroic elements. This is a heroic epic, so generally it proves Odysseus's heroism. It shows you his growth as a character, those kinds of things. But different stories with different quests prove different things. And a lot of it has to do with the culture that wrote it and what the purpose of the story is. Hubris is a Greek word for excessive pride, generally the flaw of epic heroes, from which Odysseus is not exempt, but which he is able to overcome, as opposed to, say, Antinous, who cannot overcome his pride. The Cyclops shows hubris as well. Eurymachus. There's a number of characters that exhibit hubris throughout this story. You should be able to identify a specific example of that. We also did a mythology unit to sort of introduce ourselves to the Odyssey. That's where a lot of our allusions come from, a lot of the connections that we see. But when we were looking at the mythology, the different types of myths that were presented to the class, we were able to categorize myths into three types. The why things are the way they are myths, like why do we have seasons, or why are human beings so weak and fleshy and have no abilities, or why do sorrows and cares exist and worries, or why does this river have gold dust in it, or whatever it happened to be. Why are there deserts? Then we have the impossible journey myth, on which somebody is sent on this impossible task, And then we have the reinforced social rules and exposed social taboos myths. Like the journey ones would be like Perseus and Theseus and the Minotaur and Hercules and Jason and the Argonauts and all the things that they go through. Whereas the reinforced social rules myths would be like Tantalus and Sisyphus, teaching you not to try and tempt the gods, not or Icarus, not trying to be arrogant and those sorts of things. Well, the Odyssey does all of these things. Hopefully, you've seen that over the course of the story itself. The least clear one is why things are the way they are. But for example, the ship of the Phaeacians returning to Phaeacia get turned to stone and explains why there's a boat or a rock that looks like a boat in the ocean. So you do have some of these moments about sort of why things are the way they are that are wrapped up in the Odyssey, but they're very minor and not as significant. We also have impossible journey. I mean, like clearly the Odyssey is an impossible journey. Um, Even from the beginning, it's very difficult for Odysseus to get home. But I think the part that really engages the impossible journey, part of it is sort of when he goes and sees Tiresias in the underworld. He has to go to the underworld, something that only one other mortal, pure mortal, has ever done, and that was Orpheus. And even then, Orpheus is, I think, related to the muse Calliope. Whether she's his mom or not, I don't know. So he's sort of a demigod too, and so is Hercules. And so, this one with Odysseus, I think, is kind of an impossible journey in and of itself. But he gets told by Tiresias all the horrible things that are going to happen to him and how difficult it's going to be for him to get home. And so his series of events, he even meets Hercules down there and they sympathize sort of over their labors. So I think you could easily look at the Odyssey as an impossible journey myth. And then a lot of it is reinforcing social rules and taboos. And we looked at the themes and already talked about those, so I don't need to stress those over much. But clearly, hospitality and arrogance and, a lot of those things. So the next thing we want to talk about is the hero's journey. We haven't spent a lot of time looking at the hero's journey in the Odyssey, but it's really pretty cool. If you recall, when we did this classwork, there are 12 stages of the hero's journey. And the interesting thing about the Odyssey is that the Odyssey is sort of two heroes' journeys that run parallel to each other. We've got the hero's journey of Odysseus trying to get home, and we've got the hero's journey of Telemachus trying to find his dad and get rid of the suitors. And so you end up with these two separate journeys with two different characters who are growing in different ways, and they happen simultaneously and parallel each other. Actually, this construction of the story is the root of Disney's Finding Nemo. I don't know how many of you guys have seen Finding Nemo, but Finding Nemo is just an inversion of the Odyssey story. In the Odyssey story, one story is about a son who is trying to find his father who's lost at sea, and the other story is about the father who's trying to get home from being lost at sea. Well, Finding Nemo is about a father who's trying to find his son who's lost at sea, and a son who's trying to get home after being lost at sea, right? Like, so they're very, and there's a bunch of episodes that they all go through, and it's very, and they get reunited, very similar. And I think, clearly one is based on the other. So let's take a look at the 12 stages of the hero's journey. I just want to go through them first, and then we'll go back up and we'll look at both Telemachus and Odysseus and maybe where these stages are for them. So, the ordinary world is where the hero exists before his present story begins, oblivious to the adventures to come. It's his safe place, his everyday life, where we learn crucial details about the hero, his true nature, capabilities, and outlook on life. This anchors the hero as a human, just like you or me, and makes it easier for us to identify with him and hence later empathize with his play. Actually, I'm just going to go through them right now. So, the ordinary world for Telemachus is living in his house in Ithaca. The suitors are living there. He's there with his mom. The ordinary world for Odysseus is Calypso's island, where he has lived for the past 7 years. And we're given a glimpse of his life there. Then you have the call to adventure. The hero's call to adventure begins when he receives a call to action, such as a direct threat to his safety, his family, his way of life, the peace of the community in which he lives. It may not be as dramatic as a gunshot, but simply a phone call or conversation. But whatever the call is and however it manifests itself, it ultimately disrupts the comfort of the hero's ordinary world and presents a challenge or quest that must be undertaken. For Telemachus, he has a dream in which he's visited by Athena, mentor, and told to go try and find his dad. But there is danger. The suitors are starting to plan to kill him. They're going to force his mom to marry one of them. They've discovered her ruse of the shroud that she's been weaving. So there's other sort of impetus for Telemachus to go on this adventure, but ultimately it's the dream and Athena's influence that causes him to, um, you know, take the call. Odysseus, it's Hermes coming to Calypso's island and saying that he can leave. Athena has begged Zeus to let Odysseus leave, and now this is going to happen. And so there's that. Both of them, interestingly, refuse the call. Telemachus thinks he's too young. Oh wait, let's read what it says. Although the hero may be eager to accept the quest, at this stage he will usually have fears that need overcoming, second thoughts, or even deep personal doubts as to whether or not he's up to the challenge. When this happens, a hero may refuse the call and as a result may suffer somehow. The problem he faces may seem too much to handle, and the comfort of home far more attractive than the perilous road ahead. This would also be our own response and once again helps us bond further with the reluctant hero. Yeah, Telemachus thinks he's too young. He's never gone off and done anything on his own, and so he's hesitant to follow this advice. Ultimately, he does. Odysseus thinks this all might be a trick to allow Poseidon to finally kill him. And so he's hesitant to build his boat and leave Calypso's island until he gets some reassurances. Then we have meeting the mentor. At this crucial turning point, where the hero desperately needs guidance, he meets a mentor figure who gives him something he needs. He could be given an object of great importance, insight into the dilemma he faces, wise advice, practical training, or even self confidence. Whatever the mentor provides the hero with, it serves to dispel his doubts and fears and give him strength and courage to begin his quest. Okay, in the case of Telemachus, it's literally a guy named Mentor. That's where the term comes from. It's Athena disguised as a guy named Mentor who gives him the advice and the encouragement and helps him get his ship outfitted and sail for Pylos, where he meets Nestor and goes on the adventure trying to find his dad. Odysseus is a little more difficult to identify who the mentor figure is and where they show up. It's relatively easy to say that Odysseus' mentor is Athena in the same way that Telemachus. There's a nice harmony there, and Athena certainly does help him out throughout the story, but she doesn't really show up to him in a mentor kind of way until he arrives in Ithaca, which is much, much later in the story. I would actually argue, for the sake of argument, and you feel free to disagree with me, that the best mentor figure for Odysseus in the story is Circe. Um, he does meet Hermes, and Hermes tells him how to defeat Circe, and so you could argue maybe that's a mentor moment. But Circe the witch is the one who helps him come up with the idea of going to the land of the dead, and then when he comes back, she helps him come up with the idea of putting the wax in his ears, and she gives him all this advice about how to progress his journey home. And so, for my money, it's really Circe who's sort of the mentor figure to Odysseus throughout the story. You can argue with me if you want to. Crossing the threshold. The hero is now ready to act upon his call to adventure and truly begin his quest, whether it be physical, spiritual, or emotional. He may go willingly or he may be pushed, but either way, he finally crosses the threshold between the world he is familiar with and that which he is not. It may be leaving home for the first time in his life or just doing something he has always been scared to do. However the threshold presents itself, this action signifies the hero's commitment to his journey and whatever it may have in store for him. This may be swapped with step 4 in some stories. Yeah, Telemachus crosses the threshold after he gets on the ship and leaves Ithaca for the first time. I think it's a very clear threshold moment. For Odysseus, it's a little more tricky. Is him crossing the threshold when he leaves Troy to go home? Is it him leaving Calypso's island? But that's after all of the events with Circe and all that kind of stuff. So because Odysseus' story is sort of told in this flashback way, it sort of messes with the chronological order of the hero's journey within what you've heard of him. But clearly, I think that I wouldn't say clearly. Rewind, take that word out. I think when he leaves Calypso's island and determines that he's going to go home regardless of the dangers, is sort of a crossing the threshold moment for him. Trials, allies, and enemies. Now finally out of his comfort zone, the hero is confronted with an ever more difficult series of challenges that test him in a variety of ways. Obstacles are thrown across his path, whether it be physical hurdles or people bent on thwarting his progress. The hero must overcome each challenge he is presented with on the journey towards the ultimate goal. The hero needs to find out who can be trusted and who can't. He may earn allies and meet enemies who will each in their own way help prepare him for greater ordeals yet to come. This is a stage when his skills and or powers are tested, and every obstacle that he faces helps us gain a deeper insight into his character and ultimately identify with him even more. Telemachus goes to Pylos, meets Nestor, who was an Argonaut and a companion of his father at the fight in Troy. Um, he goes to see Menelaus and talks to Menelaus, and so he has a series of adventures where he sort of makes allies and is forced to take on the role of an adult and sort of bloom into that role. But he also has suitors waiting for him on a boat to murder him as he's going home, and so we have this trials, allies, and enemies phase for sure. Going on with Telemachus. For Odysseus, obviously we saw a series of trials. The Lotus Eaters, a Cyclops, Lestrygonians, Circe, like it's a whole series of these things. And they more clearly help us understand his character and his character development when we're talking about self-control, when we're talking about overcoming his own pride and arrogance, and those sorts of things. I think you can clearly see the progression. And some of the enemies become allies, and he learns things from them, Circe in particular. So I think that's a very clear phase for Odysseus. Develop new skills. This, of course, is tied in with that. The hero's beginning to look like he may have what it takes to accomplish his quest, but he's still missing key skills that will help him be successful. Often these are taught to him by the mentor, but just as frequently they are gained through aid from an ally or experiences learned from the trials of overcoming enemies. Odysseus's gaining of skills obviously has to do with the enemies that he faces, and Telemachus, he's learning skills as he goes out for the first time. So we definitely have that. The approach to the Emos Cave is the weirdest part of the hero's journey. Um, it's a metaphor for, well, the Emos Cave may represent things in the hero's story, such as an actual location in Greek myths, the Odyssey, actually the underworld, in which lies a terrible danger or an inner conflict which up until now the hero has not had to face. As the hero approaches the cave, real or metaphorically, must make final preparations before taking that decisive leap into the great unknown. At the threshold of the Emos Cave, the hero must once again face some of the doubts and fears that first surfaced upon his call to adventure. He may need some time to reflect upon his journey and the treacherous road ahead in order to find courage to continue. This brief respite helps the audience understand the magnitude of the ordeal that awaits the hero and escalates the tension in anticipation of his ultimate test. For Odysseus, it is the underworld. He meets his dead mom there. He didn't know she was dead. He sees Agamemnon. He didn't know he was dead. You go through this whole series of encounters that both underscore and highlight for Odysseus his own mortality, but then he's also told that everybody on his ship is going to die and that it's going to be like 7 more years before he gets home, and he's going to miss the whole childhood of his son, and all of this stuff is overwhelming to Odysseus, and you get the sense that he has a real crisis after hearing this. So we definitely have, I think, approached the Inmost Cave moment there. For Telemachus, I would argue that it's Eumaeus's swineherd hut where he meets his dad, and his dad's like, "We're gonna kill the suitors," and Telemachus is like, "There's so many of them. You've come back, and now we're gonna die," right? Like, I think he's very overwhelmed by this idea that he and his dad, just two guys, are going to defeat over 100. And these have been the enemies of his entire life. Sure, he wants to defeat them, but he's full of doubts and worries about how this is all going to come out. And he's also doubting whether this is in fact his father. So I think there's a moment there very clearly. Then we have ordeal / death and resurrection. This is often the climax of the story, if you want to look at it that way. The supreme ordeal may be a dangerous physical test or a deep inner crisis that the hero must face in order to survive, or for the world in which the hero lives to continue to exist. Whether it be facing his greatest fear or most deadly foe, the hero must draw upon all of his skills and his experiences gathered upon the path to the Inmost Cave in order to overcome his most difficult challenge. Only through some form of death can the hero be reborn, experiencing a metaphorical resurrection that somehow grants him greater power or insight necessary in order to fulfill his destiny, yada yada. It goes on. But basically, for Odysseus, he did not want to be known as nobody. and he arrogantly told the Cyclops his name. Now he has to literally become nobody in his own house, pretend to be somebody else, control his emotions when he sees his dog die, when he sees his wife, when he gets insulted in his own home. And so we have this final test in which everybody assumes he's dead, but it turns out he comes back to life, right? Like, so it really fits this ordeal and death and resurrection. I wouldn't say Telemachus has this in the same way, because the story sort of stops being a Telemachus story once he reunites and accepts his dad, and is far more an Odysseus story. Then we have reward and revelation. After defeating the enemy, surviving death, and finally overcoming his greatest personal challenge, this all fits Odysseus really well. The hero is ultimately transformed into a new state, emerging from battle as a stronger person, often with a prize. In this case, the prize is his wife and his home and his family back, right? He's defeated all these suitors. And he reveals himself to be who he really is, and he's sort of got his prize. Then we have number 11, the road back. The stage in the hero's journey represents a reverse echo of the call to adventure, in which the hero had to cross the first threshold. Now he must return home. Now this sort of is weird with the Odyssey, because Odysseus is home at this point, with his reward, but this time the anticipation of danger is replaced with that of acclaim and perhaps vindication. The problem here for Odysseus is that he murdered all these suitors and he's created this blood feud. And so there is sort of a road back. How is he going to, and he's got to go off with this oar on his shoulder and make sacrifices to Poseidon. So there's still things he has to do before he can finally really be home. He's home, but he's not. And so this road back journey, I think, is him going to see his dad, and the suitors coming, the suitors' fathers coming to challenge him, and all of that kind of stuff. And then at the end, you have the return change, the final stage of the hero's journey, in which the hero returns home to his ordinary world a changed man. He will have grown as a person, learned many things, faced many terrible dangers, and even death, but now looks forward to the start of a new life. This is absolutely true of Odysseus. He's learned a lot over the course of his journey. He's faced a lot. And the reward that he has received, interestingly, is simply to live a long life and have a death come to him mild as the hand of his wife. I think that's an actual phrase that he uses. And so at the end of this, he doesn't want to be famous. He doesn't want to have glory. He doesn't care if everybody knows his name. He just wants to live a happy life in Ithaca with his family, a quiet life. That's all he really wants. And so the real change in Odysseus is that he's changed from somebody who wants to have all the glory and knowledge and power, to somebody who just wants to be happy and content. So that's the hero's journey, and hopefully you can see that for Odysseus and Telemachus pretty well. But it's a framework that fits most stories, especially heroic epics, in a really strong and meaningful way. Last thing I want to do is really quickly review the journey so that you get a sense of where he came from, where he went, and what he all went through as the story went on. So the story actually starts, if we go chronologically, from when Odysseus starts, rather than, with the flashback and all this stuff in the middle. In Troy, he sails to the land of the Cicones, where a bunch of his guys die in a fight. Then he ends up at the land of the Lotus Eaters. Down here, where he has to rescue his guys from not caring about anything. We have this metaphor for drug addiction. Then he ends up at the land of the Cyclops, where a number of his guys are eaten, and he has this logic puzzle of being in the cave and trying to find a way out, even though the Cyclops has put this giant boulder in front, and he solves that. He goes to the island of Aeolus, this little kidney bean looking island here. Aeolus gives him a bag full of winds. It's going to blow him to Ithaca, and he goes there. But the men on his ship think the bag's full of treasure, and they open it, and it blows them back to Aeolus, and he thinks that Odysseus is cursed. He is, and kicks him off the island. They go to the land of the Laestrygones, where all of Odysseus' men are eaten except for one ship, the ship he's on. And he sails away, where he lands at the island of Circe. And then all of his men get turned into pigs, and he needs the help of Hermes to defeat Circe. Once he defeats Circe and has his men turned back into men, they stay there for a year, until he finally talks to Circe, and she says that the only way that he can find out how to get home is to go to the land of the dead and talk to Tiresias. So they sail to the land of the dead, talk to Tiresias and various other people and a bunch of illusions. And he learns that the only way he and his crew get home in one piece and quickly is if they don't eat the cattle of the sun god. He goes back to Circe, and Circe tells him how to get home. He's got to go past the island of the Sirens, and between Scylla and Charybdis, and that will take him back to Ithaca. They do. In order to get past the Sirens, he puts wax in the ears of all of his crew and have them sail where they can't hear, but he wants to hear the Sirens because he's still sort of arrogant and hungry for knowledge and fame. And he ties himself to the mast of the ship and listens to the calls of the Sirens. Then they have to sail between Scylla and Charybdis, and he has a choice between risking everybody's life going over this whirlpool or losing 6 men to Scylla. He chooses to lose 6 men. He apparently prefers knowledge and limited consequences to the possibility of losing everything. But then they end up on the island of the cattle of the sun god. And these winds and gales blow in, and they're trapped there for months, and they're all starving to death. And Odysseus goes to pray to the gods, and his men eat the cattle of the sun god. So Zeus shoots down a giant thunderbolt, smashes his ship. Everybody drowns except for Odysseus, who ends up drifting to Calypso's island, where he spends 7 years crying and wanting to get home. Ultimately, he goes to the land of the Phaeacians, meets King Alcinous, tells him his story, and then is given a ship back to Ithaca, where he meets his son and has the challenge with the suitors and the bow and all of that kind of stuff. So that's sort of the overall global picture of the story and the journey itself. And hopefully that summary helps you out a little bit. I also found this fun meme, which I just thought I'd share. It's just a picture of Odysseus on his boat. Odysseus. Oh, I skipped the beginning. Sailor, raising hand. What's an Odyssey? Odysseus. A long journey named after the only survivor. Sailor. Oh, okay. Wait, what? I just think it's funny. Maybe it's just me. All right. I think that's everything. I think we have gone through all the elements of the Odyssey, and it's a pretty comprehensive review. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. I want to make sure you know everything you need to know before you go into the assessment next class, but we'll have the whole of next class to take that assessment. All right. Thanks.